What if everything you know about history is wrong? What if the grand timeline we've been taught, stretching from ancient Mesopotamia to modern skyscrapers, is actually just the latest chapter in a story that's been told countless times before? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most mind-bending possibilities our planet holds. The idea that Earth doesn't just experience natural disasters or climate shifts, but complete resets. Total do-overs that wipe the slate clean and force life to start again from scratch. I'm talking about a cycle so vast and so thorough that entire civilizations could rise, flourish, and vanish without leaving a trace we'd recognize today. And here's the unsettling part. If this has happened before, it means we might not be the first advanced society to call this planet home. We might just be the latest experiment in a cosmic game of reset and rebuild that's been playing out for far longer than we dare imagine. But before we explore what this could mean for us, let me show you why this isn't just wild speculation. There are clues scattered across our world, hidden in plain sight, that suggest something extraordinary has been happening on Earth for much longer than our history books admit. See, when we look at the official timeline of human civilization, something feels off. We're told that complex societies only began around 6,000 years ago. Before that, supposedly, our ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years doing essentially nothing, just wandering around with stone tools, living the same way generation after generation, until suddenly, almost overnight, they started building pyramids and inventing writing systems. Does that really make sense to you? We're talking about people with the same brain capacity as us, the same creative potential, the same drive to innovate. Yet we're expected to believe they remained virtually unchanged for 95% of human existence, only to suddenly explode into civilization in the last tiny sliver of time. What if that's not what happened at all? What if those hundreds of thousands of years weren't empty? What if they were full of rises and falls, advances and collapses, entire worlds that came and went before the one we know today? This is where the reset theory changes everything. It suggests that Earth operates on cycles much bigger than anything we've experienced in recorded history. Cycles that don't just affect climate or geography, but completely reshape the story of life on this planet. Think about what we know happens during major geological events. The last ice age ended just 12,000 years ago, causing sea levels to rise by over 300 feet. Entire continents of coastline vanished beneath the waves. If advanced civilizations had been thriving along those ancient shores, their cities, their monuments, their entire worlds would now be sleeping under hundreds of feet of ocean water. But it's not just rising seas that could trigger resets. Throughout Earth's history, we see evidence of catastrophic events that reshape everything. Massive volcanic eruptions that block out the sun for years. Asteroid impacts that throw debris into the atmosphere and trigger global climate collapse. These aren't theoretical possibilities. They're documented events that have happened repeatedly throughout our planet's history. The Toba supervolcano erupted just 74,000 years ago with such devastating force that it nearly drove humanity to extinction. Genetic studies suggest our entire species was reduced to perhaps just a few thousand survivors scattered across the globe. That's a reset on a scale we can barely comprehend. And that was relatively recent in geological terms. Go back further, and you find the asteroid impact that ended the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. In a single day, an entire world died. The dominant life forms that had ruled for over 150 million years simply vanished, making room for mammals to eventually take over. But here's what's fascinating. Life didn't just disappear after these catastrophes. It adapted, evolved, and rebuilt. New forms emerged from the survivors, often reaching heights of complexity that rivaled or exceeded what came before. The pattern repeats over and over throughout Earth's history. Destruction followed by renewal, collapse followed by rebirth. Now, Imagine if intelligent civilizations got caught in these cycles, not just once, but repeatedly. Each time they reached a certain level of advancement, boom, reset. The survivors would be thrown back to basic survival mode, forced to rebuild from scattered remnants while most of their achievements crumbled away or got buried under geological changes. This would explain so many puzzles that mainstream archaeology struggles with. Why do we find structures like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built with sophisticated knowledge over 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture was supposed to exist? Why do ancient maps seem to show coastlines from thousands of years before they should have been known? Why do cultures separated by oceans all tell remarkably similar stories about great floods and previous ages of humanity? What if these aren't coincidences or myths, but fragments of memory? Pieces of knowledge that somehow survived from earlier cycles, carried forward by survivors who remembered fragments of what their world had been before the reset hit. The more you look at the evidence with this perspective, the more the pieces start falling into place. Those mysterious gaps in the archaeological record where nothing seems to happen for thousands of years. Maybe something was happening, but the evidence got erased. Those sudden leaps forward in human capability, like the agricultural revolution or the rapid development of writing systems. Maybe those weren't inventions, but rediscoveries. Consider how fragile our own civilization really is. If a major catastrophe struck tomorrow, how much of our knowledge would actually survive? Most of our information is stored digitally, completely dependent on electrical systems and maintained infrastructure. Our cities are built along coastlines that would be devastated by rising seas. Our global supply chains would collapse if major transportation networks were disrupted. Within just a few centuries of abandonment, our greatest achievements would start crumbling. Metal would rust, concrete would crack and crumble, wood would rot away. Give it a few thousand years, and nature would reclaim everything. Forests would grow through our former streets, rivers would change course and wash away foundations, and most traces of our technological society would simply disappear. That's not speculation. We can see it happening already in places like Chernobyl, where just a few decades of abandonment have allowed nature to begin taking back what was once a thriving city. Scale that up to thousands or tens of thousands of years, and you start to understand how entire civilizations could vanish so completely that we'd never know they existed. But sometimes, just sometimes, fragments survive. A structure gets buried instead of destroyed, preserving it under layers of earth. An artifact gets caught in just the right conditions to avoid decay. A story gets passed down through generations, evolving into myth, but carrying a kernel of truth about what really happened. These fragments are what we need to look for if we want to understand the true scope of Earth's resets. Not obvious ruins or clear artifacts, because those would be long gone. Instead, we need to search for anomalies, things that don't quite fit the standard timeline. Structures that seem too advanced for their supposed age. Maps that show knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Stories that repeat across cultures in ways that suggest shared memory rather than coincidence. The geological record itself might hold the strongest evidence. Scientists have already identified layers in ice cores and sediment that show sudden, dramatic changes in Earth's climate and atmosphere. Some of these changes happened so quickly and severely that they would have been devastating to any complex society trying to maintain itself during the chaos. The Younger Dryas period is one example. About 12,800 years ago, just as the world was warming up from the last ice age, temperatures suddenly plunged back into freezing conditions for over 1,000 years. Some researchers believe this was triggered by a comet impact that set off massive wildfires and threw debris into the atmosphere. If an advanced civilization had been developing during the gradual warming period, this sudden return to ice age conditions would have been catastrophic. Their carefully built settlements would have been abandoned, their agricultural systems would have failed, and their population would have been scattered to the winds. the survivors would have faced a completely different world than the one their ancestors had known. They would have been forced to focus entirely on basic survival, and much of their accumulated knowledge would have been lost within a few generations. To us, looking back, it would appear as though nothing advanced had existed during that earlier period, because the reset erased almost all traces of what had been there. This is why the idea of Earth being reset thousands of times is so compelling and so unsettling. It suggests that the story of intelligent life on our planet might be far older and far more complex than we've ever imagined. We might be standing on the bones of countless previous attempts at civilization, each one reaching impressive heights before being swept away by forces beyond their control. And if that's true, then we need to ask ourselves some very uncomfortable questions. What makes us think we're different? What makes us believe our civilization will be the one to break the cycle? Are we really at the pinnacle of human achievement? Or are we just the latest group to think we've figured it all out, right before the next reset arrives? The evidence we're about to explore suggests that these resets aren't just possible, they're inevitable. And the traces they've left behind are hiding in places we're only beginning to look. From underwater ruins that shouldn't exist to artifacts that predate known civilization by thousands of years, the clues are scattered across our world like breadcrumbs leading back to forgotten ages. But finding these breadcrumbs requires us to think differently about time, about history, and about our place in the grand story of this planet. It requires us to consider that the silence in our archaeological record might not represent emptiness, but erasure. That the gaps in our timeline might not show us where nothing happened, but where everything that happened got wiped clean and buried under the weight of geological time. The most disturbing part about these resets isn't just that they happen, but how completely they erase what came before. We're talking about a level of destruction so thorough that entire chapters of human achievement simply vanish from the record. And yet, if you know where to look, the whispers are still there. Let me tell you about something that shouldn't exist. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Japan, lies a structure that defies everything we think we know about ancient history. The Yonaguni Monument stretches across several football fields, carved with what appear to be deliberate steps, terraces, and right angles. The kind of precision that screams human construction. Here's the problem. This monument sits in waters that have been submerged for over 10,000 years. That means if humans built it, they were creating sophisticated architecture long before we supposedly figured out basic agriculture. The mainstream explanation: it's just a natural rock formation shaped by erosion. But when you see the clean lines, the organized layout, the way everything fits together like pieces of a massive puzzle, natural erosion starts to feel like a pretty weak explanation. And Yonaguni isn't alone. Scattered across the ocean floors of the world are structures that hint at something far more complex than our timeline allows. Off the coast of India, sonar scans have revealed what look like the remains of vast cities now sleeping under hundreds of feet of water. Near Greece, perfectly preserved streets and buildings rest just beneath the surface, their courtyards and walls still clearly defined after thousands of years underwater. These aren't just random stones that happen to fall in interesting patterns. These are organized, planned settlements that tell us humans were building on a massive scale long before official history says it was possible. And they're underwater for one simple reason. When the last ice age ended, sea levels rose so dramatically that entire continents of coastline disappeared beneath the waves. Think about where humans build their cities today. Almost every major population center on Earth sits near water. Coastlines provide food, transportation, and trade routes. They're the natural gathering points for growing civilizations. If our ancestors followed the same logic, then their greatest achievements would have been built exactly where rising seas could destroy them most completely. But the ocean isn't the only place that holds secrets. Sometimes the evidence gets buried instead of drowned, preserved under layers of earth that accumulate over thousands of years. And when archaeologists dig deep enough, they occasionally find things that make them question everything they thought they knew. Take the recent discoveries at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. When researchers first uncovered these massive stone circles, they assumed they were looking at something from the early agricultural period, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years old, standard stuff for that region. But when they dated the site, they got a number that broke their understanding of human development. 11,600 years old, built by people who weren't supposed to have the organization, the tools or the knowledge to create something so sophisticated. These aren't rough stone piles thrown together by wandering hunter-gatherers. These are precisely carved pillars, arranged in complex patterns, decorated with intricate artwork, organized into ceremonial spaces that required planning, cooperation, and skills that our timeline says didn't exist yet. The site is so advanced for its supposed time period that it forced archaeologists to completely rewrite their theories about when human civilization actually began. But here's what really gets your attention. Göbekli Tepe wasn't abandoned gradually or destroyed by enemies. Around 8,000 years ago, the entire complex was deliberately buried. Someone took the time and effort to cover these magnificent structures with tons of earth, preserving them perfectly, but hiding them from view. Why would you bury your greatest achievement? Unless you knew something terrible was coming and wanted to protect what you'd built for whoever might find it later. The more you examine sites like this, the more they feel like time capsules. Messages left behind by people who understood that their world was ending and wanted to leave proof that they had existed, that they had achieved something worth remembering. And it's not just individual sites that tell this story. When you map out archaeological discoveries around the world, you start to see a pattern that mainstream history struggles to explain. Advanced construction techniques appearing simultaneously in places that supposedly had no contact with each other. Similar architectural styles showing up on different continents, separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Knowledge of astronomy and mathematics emerging independently in cultures that weren't supposed to be capable of such sophistication. The conventional explanation is parallel development. The idea that humans naturally develop similar solutions to similar problems, even when they're completely isolated from each other. But when you look at the specifics, parallel development starts to feel like a pretty convenient excuse for patterns that might have a much simpler explanation. What if these weren't independent developments at all? What if they were fragments of shared knowledge, carried by survivors from an earlier cycle who scattered across the globe when their world was reset? Small groups who remembered pieces of what their ancestors had known, rebuilding what they could in new locations with whatever resources they could find. This would explain why we see such sophisticated astronomical knowledge in cultures that were supposedly just figuring out basic agriculture. Why ancient maps seem to show coastlines and land masses that weren't supposed to be known for thousands of years. Why myths and legends from completely separate cultures tell remarkably similar stories about great floods, fires from the sky, and previous ages of humanity that were destroyed and reborn. Take the flood myths that appear in virtually every culture on Earth. The details change from place to place, but the core story remains the same. A great civilization exists, becomes corrupt, or faces divine judgment, and gets wiped out by rising waters. Only a few people survive to start over and repopulate the world. We've been taught to see these as symbolic stories, moral lessons about the consequences of human behavior. But what if they're something else entirely? What if they're cultural memories, passed down through generations of survivors who witnessed the actual destruction of their world when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age? The geological evidence supports this interpretation perfectly. We know that massive flooding occurred around the world as ice sheets melted. We know that vast areas of habitable land were submerged, forcing populations to relocate inland. We know that this process happened rapidly enough to be traumatic for anyone living through it. If advanced civilizations had developed along those ancient coastlines, the rising waters would have been exactly the kind of world-ending catastrophe that gets remembered in stories and passed down through generations. The flood myths might not be symbolic at all. They might be historical accounts, preserved in the only way possible when written records get destroyed along with everything else. But floods aren't the only reset mechanism that shows up in ancient stories. Fire from the sky appears just as frequently, described as comets, falling stars, or divine judgment that burns the world clean. And again, we have geological evidence that supports these accounts. Impact craters, layers of ash and debris, sudden climate changes that match the timelines described in various cultural traditions. The Younger Dryas event I mentioned earlier fits this pattern perfectly. Around 12,800 years ago, something caused massive wildfires across North America, sudden climate cooling, and the extinction of large mammals. Some researchers believe it was caused by a comet or asteroid impact, exactly the kind of fire from the sky that appears in myths from that same time period. If civilizations were developing during the warmer period just before this event, they would have been completely unprepared for the sudden return to Ice Age conditions. Their agricultural systems would have failed overnight. Their settlements would have been abandoned. Their populations would have been scattered or eliminated entirely. The survivors would have been thrown back into survival mode, forced to live as nomadic hunter-gatherers until conditions improved enough for them to attempt rebuilding. And when they did start to recover, thousands of years later, they would have retained only fragments of what their ancestors had known, pieces of knowledge preserved in oral traditions, passed down as stories that gradually transformed into myths and legends. This is why the archaeological record shows such dramatic gaps and sudden leaps forward. Not because nothing happened during those empty periods, but because most of what happened got erased by resets that destroyed the physical evidence while leaving only scattered survivors to carry fragments of memory forward into the next cycle. The silence between civilizations isn't empty space. It's the sound of worlds ending and new ones struggling to begin. It's the pause between the last note of one song and the first note of the next, played out across thousands of years by forces so vast that we can barely comprehend their scale. And if this cycle has repeated thousands of times throughout Earth's history, then we need to start asking some very serious questions about our own place in this pattern. Because every civilization that came before us probably thought they were special too. They probably believed they were the first to reach such heights of achievement. They probably assumed their knowledge would last forever, right up until the moment it didn't. Right now, as you're watching this, our planet is carrying the weight of secrets buried so deep that most of us will never even think to look for them. But every once in a while, someone stumbles across something that doesn't belong. Something that makes you stop and wonder if, maybe, just maybe, we've been telling ourselves the wrong story about who we are and how long we've been here. Let me paint you a picture of what reset evidence actually looks like when you find it. It's never obvious. It's never sitting there waiting for you with a sign that says, ancient lost civilization. Instead, it shows up as anomalies. Things that make experts scratch their heads and quietly admit that maybe the textbooks got it wrong. Picture a mining operation in South Africa, workers blasting through rock layers that are supposed to be billions of years old. Suddenly, they're pulling up metal spheres with grooves carved around them. Perfect circles that look manufactured. The geological dating says they're impossibly ancient, but the craftsmanship suggests intelligence. Mainstream science calls them natural formations, but when you hold one in your hands, natural formation feels like the kind of explanation you give when you don't have a better one, or consider the Antikythera mechanism pulled from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. For decades, it sat in a museum labelled as a corroded chunk of bronze. Nobody bothered to look closer until X-ray technology revealed what was actually inside. A device so sophisticated that nothing like it appears again in the historical record for over 1,000 years. gears within gears, calculating planetary movements and predicting eclipses with precision that shouldn't have been possible in ancient Greece. Here's what really gets you thinking. If one device like this survived by pure accident, falling into just the right conditions to be preserved underwater, how many others were there? How many similar technologies existed in the ancient world but got lost to time because they weren't lucky enough to sink in exactly the right spot? This is the problem with looking for reset evidence. You're not searching for obvious proof. You're looking for exceptions to the rules we've created about what was possible when. And those exceptions are scattered across the globe like puzzle pieces from a picture we can't quite see. Take the Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq and dating back over 2,000 years. It's a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When you add an acidic solution, it generates electrical current. Not much, but enough to electroplate metal objects. The question isn't whether it works, because it does. The question is what a civilization was doing with electrical technology 2 millennia before we supposedly figured out how electricity functions. Or look at the precision stone cutting found at sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia. We're talking about blocks weighing over 100 tons, cut with tolerances tighter than what modern machinery can achieve. The surfaces are so flat and smooth that you can't slip a piece of paper between the joints. Yet we're told this was accomplished by people using stone tools and copper chisels. Every time discoveries like these surface, the mainstream explanation follows the same pattern. It's either dismissed as a hoax, explained away as a natural formation, or grudgingly accepted but labelled as an anomaly that doesn't change the bigger picture. But what if these aren't anomalies at all? What if they're exactly what you'd expect to find if advanced civilizations had risen and fallen repeatedly throughout history? The thing about resets is that they're not gentle. They don't carefully preserve the best examples of human achievement for future archaeologists to discover. They're violent, chaotic events that destroy almost everything in their path. What survives is random. A device happens to sink in the right conditions. A structure gets buried instead of destroyed. A piece of knowledge gets encoded in stone instead of written on materials that decay. From our perspective, these survivors look like impossible outliers because we're trying to fit them into a timeline that assumes steady, linear progress. But if you flip the assumption and imagine cycles of rise and fall, suddenly these outliers make perfect sense. They're not evidence that ancient people occasionally got lucky and stumbled onto advanced techniques. They're fragments of knowledge that survived when entire civilizations didn't. And here's where it gets really interesting. The deeper we dig, both literally and figuratively, the more of these fragments we find. Not fewer, which is what you'd expect if they were genuine anomalies. More. As though we're peeling back layers of a story that's far more complex than the simple narrative we've been telling ourselves. Underground chambers in Egypt that predate the pyramids by thousands of years. Stone structures in Russia built with techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Artifacts in museums around the world that sit in storage because they don't fit the accepted timeline and nobody wants to deal with the implications of studying them seriously. Each discovery on its own can be explained away. Natural formation, misidentification, contamination from later periods. But when you step back and look at the pattern, when you see how these anomalies cluster around certain time periods and geographical regions, the explanations start feeling less convincing, especially when you realize that most of Earth's surface has never been seriously examined for archaeological evidence. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. Vast areas of land remain unexcavated because there's no reason to expect anything interesting there. And we rarely dig deep enough to reach layers from truly ancient periods because the funding and effort required is enormous and the expected payoff is small. This creates a massive blind spot in our search for evidence. If resets have been occurring for hundreds of thousands of years, most of the proof would be buried under layers of sediment, scattered across ocean floors, or hidden in regions we've never thought to explore. The silence in the archaeological record might not represent absence of civilization. it might represent absence of investigation. But even within the limited areas we have explored, the evidence keeps turning up. Ancient mines in Africa that were worked on industrial scales thousands of years before they should have been. Massive stone circles in Turkey that required organizational capabilities we don't associate with hunter-gatherer societies. Astronomical alignments in structures around the world that demonstrate knowledge of celestial mechanics that supposedly wasn't developed until much later in history. The pattern becomes even clearer when you look at what happened during known historical collapses. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE wiped out advanced civilizations across the Mediterranean. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks vanished. Technologies were lost for centuries. And this happened during recorded history, when we have multiple sources documenting what was lost. Imagine the same kind of collapse occurring during prehistoric periods, when there were no written records to preserve the memory of what existed before. An advanced civilization could rise, flourish for thousands of years, and then vanish so completely that later peoples would have no idea it had ever existed. The only traces would be scattered artifacts and structures that would seem impossibly advanced for their supposed time period. This is exactly what we see in the archaeological record. Not a smooth progression from simple to complex, but sudden appearances of sophisticated technology followed by long periods of apparent regression. The pattern repeats over and over throughout history, as though civilizations keep reaching certain levels of achievement and then getting knocked back to basics by forces beyond their control. And it's not just human civilizations that show this pattern. The geological record reveals the same cycle of rise and collapse playing out across all forms of life. Species emerge, dominate their environments, and then disappear in mass extinction events that clear the stage for new forms to evolve. The difference is that geological time operates on scales so vast that these cycles become invisible to creatures living within them. But what if intelligent civilizations are subject to the same forces that drive biological evolution? What if consciousness itself is just another adaptation that emerges, flourishes, and gets reset along with everything else when conditions change dramatically enough? From this perspective, we're not the culmination of a steady climb toward greater intelligence and technological sophistication. We're just the current iteration of a process that's been running for much longer than we realize. Previous iterations reached different levels of development before getting reset by catastrophic events that we can still read in the geological record if we know what to look for. The Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago. The Younger Dryas, cooling event 12,800 years ago. The end Pleistocene extinction that wiped out most large mammals around the same time. Each of these events was severe enough to collapse any complex civilization that might have existed when they occurred. And those are just the recent ones we know about. Go back further in Earth's history and you find evidence of even more dramatic resets. Asteroid impacts, massive volcanic eruptions, rapid climate shifts that transformed entire continents within spans of time too short for complex societies to adapt. Each reset would have scattered the survivors, destroyed their infrastructure, and forced them to focus on basic survival rather than maintaining advanced knowledge. Within a few generations, most of what their ancestors had achieved would be lost. What remained would be fragments, pieces of information preserved in oral traditions that gradually transformed into myths and legends as they were passed down through cultures that no longer understood their original meaning. This is why flood stories appear in virtually every culture on Earth, despite being geographically separated by thousands of miles. It's why creation myths often describe previous worlds that were destroyed before the current one began. It's why so many traditions speak of golden ages when people possessed knowledge and abilities that were later lost. These aren't just symbolic stories created to teach moral lessons. They're cultural memories of actual events, preserved in the only way possible when physical evidence gets destroyed, along with the civilizations that created it. The myths are trying to tell us something important about our past, but we've been trained to dismiss them as primitive superstition rather than recognize them as historical accounts encoded in symbolic language. When you start reading ancient texts with this perspective, the stories take on entirely different meanings. The Hindu concept of cyclical time, with vast ages of creation and destruction repeating endlessly. The Aztec belief that they were living in the fifth world, after 4 previous creations had been destroyed. The Norse concept of Ragnarok, where the current world ends in catastrophe, but a new one emerges from the ashes. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts. They're descriptions of a process that their ancestors had witnessed and remembered, a process that we're still part of, whether we realize it or not. And here's where the story gets really disturbing. Because if these cycles are real, if Earth has been reset thousands of times, then we need to confront an uncomfortable truth about our own supposed uniqueness. Every scrap of evidence suggests that we're not the first intelligent species to look up at the stars and wonder if we're alone. We might just be the latest in a long line of civilizations that thought they were special, right up until they weren't. The fossil record hints at this possibility in ways that make mainstream science deeply uncomfortable. Take the Cambrian explosion, that sudden burst of complex life forms that appeared around 540 million years ago. For billions of years, life on Earth was simple. Single-celled organisms, basic multicellular creatures, nothing that showed signs of advanced organization or intelligence. Then, in what amounts to an instant in geological terms, the oceans filled with sophisticated creatures displaying complex behaviors, advanced sensory systems, and organizational structures that rival anything we see today. Eyes appeared, nervous systems developed, predator-prey relationships became intricate dances of survival and adaptation. The standard explanation is that evolution suddenly accelerated, driven by environmental changes and genetic innovations. But when you look at the pattern, it feels eerily similar to what we see in human development. Long periods of apparent stagnation followed by explosive leaps forward that seem to come out of nowhere. What if intelligence has been emerging and disappearing throughout Earth's history, not just in humans, but in forms we can't even recognize? What if consciousness is like any other evolutionary adaptation, appearing when conditions are right and vanishing when they're not? The geological record is full of extinction events that wiped out dominant species and cleared the way for entirely new forms of life. The Permian extinction, 250 million years ago, eliminated over 90% of all marine species and 70% of land species. The Ordovician extinction, 440 million years ago, devastated ocean ecosystems when ice ages locked up so much water that sea levels dropped dramatically. Each time, life recovered and evolved in new directions. But what if some of those directions included intelligence? What if consciousness emerged multiple times throughout Earth's history, only to get reset along with everything else when catastrophic events reshaped the planet? We tend to think of intelligence as rare, as something that happened only once in the entire history of Earth. But that assumption is based on looking at just the tiniest slice of geological time. The period when humans have existed is essentially invisible on the scale of the planet's history. We've been here for maybe 300,000 years, on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old. That's like looking at the last second of a 24-hour day and concluding that nothing interesting happened during the other 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. It's a perspective so narrow that it tells us almost nothing about the larger story. And even within that narrow time frame, we're constantly discovering that our ancestors were capable of far more than we previously believed. Every year brings new archaeological finds that push back the dates for human achievement. Advanced tool use, sophisticated art, complex social structures, all appearing earlier in the timeline than our models predicted. The pattern suggests that we keep underestimating what was possible in the past, because we're looking for evidence of civilizations that developed exactly like ours. But what if previous cycles took completely different paths? What if intelligence expressed itself in ways that left traces we don't recognize as artificial? Consider how different our own civilization would look to archaeologists if it had developed without metals, if our ancestors had mastered biotechnology instead of mechanical engineering, creating tools and structures from living materials that would decompose completely within centuries of abandonment. Or imagine a civilization that focused on information rather than physical construction, storing their knowledge in geological formations or genetic codes that would survive longer than any monument. Their achievements would be invisible to us because we're looking for the wrong kind of evidence. This is the challenge of searching for reset civilizations. They wouldn't necessarily look like scaled-up versions of Bronze Age societies. They might have taken paths so different from our own development that we wouldn't recognize their achievements as technological at all. But sometimes, just sometimes, we find hints that make you wonder what we're missing. Genetic anomalies in modern humans that suggest our ancestors went through severe population bottlenecks multiple times throughout history. Not just the Toba eruption 74,000 years ago, but earlier events that reduced our species to tiny surviving populations scattered across the globe. Each bottleneck represents a near-extinction event, a moment when human civilization, whatever form it had taken, was almost completely wiped out. The survivors would have carried fragments of knowledge forward, but most of what their ancestors had achieved would have been lost in the chaos. This explains why human development seems to happen in sudden bursts rather than steady progression. We're not seeing continuous advancement. We're seeing recovery periods, when scattered survivors finally reach populations large enough and stable enough to begin rebuilding what had been lost. The agricultural revolution around 10,000 years ago might not have been the invention of farming, but its rediscovery. The rapid development of writing systems might not have been humanity's first attempt at recording information, but its latest. The sudden appearance of complex, astronomical knowledge in ancient cultures might not represent new discoveries, but the recovery of understanding that had existed before previous resets destroyed the civilizations that had developed it. From this perspective, human history looks less like a straight line and more like a spiral. We keep returning to similar achievements, but each time from a different angle, building on fragments of memory that survived from earlier cycles. And if this pattern has been repeating for hundreds of thousands of years, then the archaeological record's strange silences start making sense. Those long periods where nothing seems to happen aren't empty time. They're recovery periods, when survivors slowly rebuilt their populations and began the long process of rediscovering what their ancestors had known. The sudden appearances of sophisticated technology aren't miraculous innovations. They're breakthrough moments when enough knowledge had been recovered to begin achieving things that looked impossible to the people experiencing them, but which were actually rediscoveries of capabilities that had existed before. This interpretation fits the evidence far better than the standard model of steady progression from simple to complex. It explains the gaps, the sudden leaps, the anomalous artifacts that don't fit the timeline, and the persistent myths about previous ages of humanity that were destroyed and reborn. But it also raises troubling questions about our own future. If we're part of this cycle, if our civilization is just the latest iteration in a pattern that's been repeating for hundreds of thousands of years, then what makes us think we're different? What makes us believe we'll be the ones to break the pattern? Every previous civilization probably felt the same way. They probably looked at their achievements and assumed they had transcended the forces that had destroyed earlier cycles. They probably believed their knowledge would last forever, and their cities would stand for all time, until they didn't. The geological record shows that resets aren't gentle processes that give civilizations time to prepare. They're sudden, catastrophic events that overwhelm any attempts at preservation. When the Younger Dryas cooling began 12,800 years ago, temperatures dropped so quickly that any agricultural civilization trying to survive would have faced immediate starvation. Their stored food would have run out within months, their crops would have failed completely, and their populations would have been forced to scatter or die. The survivors would have reverted to hunter-gatherer lifestyles, not by choice, but by necessity. Within a few generations, most of what their ancestors had built would have been forgotten. The knowledge would survive only in fragments, preserved in stories that gradually transformed into myths as they were passed down through cultures that no longer understood their original meaning. This is why reset evidence is so hard to find. It's not just that physical structures decay over time. It's that the resets themselves are so devastating that they eliminate most traces of what came before. What survives is random, scattered, and often unrecognizable as evidence of advanced civilization. A device happens to fall into conditions that preserve it for thousands of years, but without context, it looks like an impossible anomaly. A structure gets buried instead of destroyed, but when it's finally uncovered, it seems far too advanced for its supposed age. A piece of knowledge gets encoded in stone, but the civilization that created the encoding is long gone, leaving us to puzzle over meanings we can't decode. The fragments are there, scattered across the archaeological record like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle we don't have the box top for. We can see that the pieces don't fit the picture we've been trying to build, but we don't know what picture they're actually supposed to create. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the resets aren't bugs in the system of planetary development. Maybe they're features. Maybe Earth operates on cycles so vast that individual civilizations are just temporary expressions of a much larger process, each one contributing something to the overall development of consciousness, before being recycled to make room for the next iteration. From this perspective, our achievements aren't endings, but contributions to a story that's much bigger than any individual civilization can comprehend. The knowledge we develop, the problems we solve, the art we create, all of it becomes part of a larger pool of information that somehow survives even when the civilizations that created it don't. This would explain why certain innovations appear repeatedly throughout history. Not because different cultures independently developed the same solutions, but because the solutions already existed in some form, waiting to be rediscovered by each new cycle of civilization as it reached the appropriate level of development. The wheel wasn't invented multiple times in different places. It was remembered. Writing wasn't developed independently by various cultures. It was reconstructed from fragments of memory that survived from previous cycles. Astronomy wasn't discovered by ancient peoples looking at the stars for the first time. It was recovered from knowledge that had been encoded in monuments and myths by civilizations that had mapped the heavens long before. This interpretation makes the rapid development of human civilization far less mysterious. We didn't go from stone tools to space travel in just a few thousand years through pure innovation. We accomplished it by rebuilding on foundations that had been laid by countless previous attempts, each one contributing pieces to a puzzle that we're still trying to complete. But if that's true, then we need to start thinking very seriously about what our contribution will be. What knowledge are we developing that might survive the next reset? What problems are we solving that future iterations of civilization will need to rediscover? What are we building that might serve as foundations for whatever comes after us? Because if the pattern holds, if Earth continues operating on cycles of reset and renewal, then our time at the top of the food chain is temporary. Eventually, something will come along that's powerful enough to knock us back to basics, just as it has happened to every other dominant species in Earth's history. The question isn't whether it will happen. The geological record makes it clear that resets are inevitable. The question is when and what will survive to help the next cycle rebuild from our ruins. Maybe the most chilling part about all of this isn't what we might lose in the next reset, but what we've already lost without knowing it. Right now, beneath our feet, scattered across ocean floors, buried under miles of ice, there could be technologies that would revolutionize our understanding of what's possible. knowledge that took previous civilizations thousands of years to develop, sitting there waiting for us to stumble across it by accident. Think about the implications for just a moment. We're spending billions of dollars trying to solve problems that might have already been solved. Energy crises, climate change, space travel, diseases that kill millions of people every year. What if the solutions are already out there, locked away in ruins we haven't found, or encoded in symbols we can't read? This isn't just speculation anymore. We're starting to find evidence that our ancestors knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. Take the Nazca lines in Peru. Massive drawings carved into the desert floor that can only be properly viewed from aircraft. Why would a culture create art that they couldn't see unless they had some way of getting airborne? The standard explanation is that they were created for the gods, religious symbols meant to be viewed from heaven. But when you actually look at the precision involved, the mathematical accuracy of the lines and the way they incorporate knowledge of the surrounding geography, religious symbolism starts feeling like a pretty inadequate explanation. Some of these lines stretch for miles in perfectly straight paths, crossing valleys and mountains without deviation. Creating them would have required surveying techniques and mathematical knowledge that we associate with much later periods of human development. Yet there they are, carved into the landscape over 1,000 years ago by people who supposedly didn't have access to advanced tools or measurement systems. And the Nazca lines aren't unique. All over the world, you find evidence of ancient peoples accomplishing things that seem impossible given the tools and knowledge they're supposed to have had. The Easter Island statues, weighing up to 80 tons each, somehow transported across the island and positioned with precision. The Baalbek stones in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons, cut and moved using techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Each time these discoveries surface, mainstream archaeology finds ways to explain them within the existing framework. Maybe they had more sophisticated tools than we thought. Maybe they used techniques we haven't considered. Maybe they were just really good at working with primitive technology. But what if the framework itself is wrong? What if these aren't examples of primitive people getting lucky or being more clever than we assumed? What if they're exactly what you'd expect to find if knowledge from previous cycles had survived in fragments, passed down through generations and applied by cultures that no longer fully understood where it came from? This would explain why so many ancient cultures possessed astronomical knowledge that seems far beyond what they should have been able to develop independently. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern measurements. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes over 25,000 years to complete and would be impossible to observe within a single human lifetime. How do you discover something like that without instruments? How do you measure celestial cycles that span dozens of generations? The conventional answer is patience and careful observation passed down through centuries of astronomers. But there's another possibility. What if this knowledge wasn't discovered by these cultures at all? What if it was inherited from earlier cycles that had already figured out the movements of the heavens? The same pattern appears in mathematics, medicine, and engineering. Ancient cultures displaying knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop, appearing almost fully formed in the archaeological record, not gradually building up from simple concepts, but emerging with sophistication that suggests it came from somewhere else. Take the Antikythera mechanism again. This isn't just an isolated example of ancient ingenuity. It's evidence that mechanical engineering was far more advanced in the ancient world than we ever suspected. But here's what's really disturbing about it. The device was found in a shipwreck from around 60 BCE, but the technology it represents disappears from the historical record for over 1,000 years after that. Think about what that means. Someone in ancient Greece had figured out how to create precise geared mechanisms capable of astronomical calculations. They understood metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and complex mathematics well enough to build what amounts to an analog computer. Then that knowledge vanished completely, not to reappear until medieval clockmakers started developing similar techniques over a millennium later. That's not how technological development is supposed to work. Once you figure out how to do something, especially something as useful as precision manufacturing, that knowledge should spread and improve. It should become the foundation for even more advanced techniques. It shouldn't just disappear and have to be reinvented from scratch centuries later. Unless something happened to the civilization that created it, something catastrophic enough to break the chain of knowledge transmission and force the survivors to focus on basic survival rather than maintaining advanced technology. This pattern repeats throughout history. Advanced knowledge appearing, flourishing briefly, then vanishing for long periods before being rediscovered. It's as though civilizations keep reaching certain technological thresholds and then getting knocked back before they can fully establish their innovations. The Library of Alexandria is probably the most famous example. For centuries, it served as the repository of human knowledge, collecting texts and information from across the known world. Scholars estimate it contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering everything from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and engineering. Then it was destroyed, not all at once, but gradually, through a combination of political upheaval, religious conflicts, and simple neglect. By the time it was completely gone, most of the knowledge it had contained was lost forever. Entire fields of study vanished. Mathematical techniques, scientific discoveries, historical records, all wiped out because the institution that preserved them couldn't survive the changing political landscape. Now imagine something similar happening on a global scale. Not just one library being destroyed, but entire civilizations being scattered by catastrophic events. All the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years, gone in a single generation. The survivors left to rebuild from whatever fragments they could remember or preserve. This is what resets do. They don't just destroy buildings and kill people. They sever the connections between generations, breaking the chains of knowledge transmission that allows civilizations to build on their past achievements. Without those connections, even the most advanced societies can collapse back to subsistence levels within just a few decades. We've seen this happen in recorded history. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE destroyed advanced civilizations across the Mediterranean. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks vanished. Technologies were lost. Entire regions reverted to simpler ways of life and didn't recover their former sophistication for centuries. And that happened during a period when we have written records documenting what was lost. Imagine the same kind of collapse occurring during prehistoric periods, when there were no texts to preserve the memory of what existed before. Advanced civilizations could rise and fall without leaving any trace that future archaeologists would recognize as evidence of their achievements. The silence in the archaeological record starts looking different when you consider this possibility. Those long periods where nothing seems to happen aren't necessarily empty time. They might be recovery periods, when scattered survivors slowly rebuilt their populations and began the long process of rediscovering what their ancestors had known. And the sudden appearances of sophisticated knowledge aren't miraculous innovations. They're breakthrough moments when enough information had been recovered to begin achieving things that looked impossible to the people experiencing them, but which were actually reconstructions of capabilities that had existed before. This interpretation explains why human development seems to happen in bursts rather than steady progression. We're not seeing continuous advancement. We're seeing cycles of loss and recovery, each one building on fragments salvaged from previous iterations. But here's where it gets really unsettling. If this pattern has been repeating throughout human history, then we need to ask ourselves some very uncomfortable questions about our own situation. Are we at the peak of a cycle that's about to be reset? Are we rebuilding on foundations laid by civilizations we don't even remember? And most importantly, what happens when the next catastrophic event comes along? Because the geological record makes it clear that such events are inevitable, not just possible, but guaranteed. The only questions are when and how severe the next one will be. The Yellowstone supervolcano is overdue for an eruption by geological standards. When it goes off, and it will eventually, it could trigger a volcanic winter that would collapse agricultural systems across the globe. The ash cloud would block sunlight for years, dropping global temperatures and causing massive crop failures. Our civilization, dependent on complex supply chains and just-in-time delivery systems, would be completely unprepared for that kind of disruption. Within months, most of the world would be facing starvation. Within a few years, the population would be reduced to small groups of survivors struggling to maintain basic technologies. And that's just one possibility. Asteroid impacts happen regularly on geological timescales. The last major one was only 65 million years ago, recent enough that we should expect another one eventually. Solar flares could knock out electrical grids and satellite systems, crippling the digital infrastructure our civilization depends on. Even something as simple as a shift in ocean currents could trigger rapid climate change that would make large areas of the planet uninhabitable. Any of these events could serve as reset triggers, powerful enough to collapse our interconnected global civilization and force the survivors back to subsistence levels. And unlike previous cycles, we've become so specialized and dependent on technology that we might be even more vulnerable than our ancestors were. Think about it. How many people today know how to grow food without industrial agriculture? How many could make tools without access to manufactured materials? How many understand the basic principles behind the technologies they use every day? We've created a civilization of incredible sophistication, but we've also created one where most people are completely dependent on systems they don't understand and couldn't recreate if they had to. If those systems collapsed, the knowledge they represent would be lost just as completely as the contents of the Library of Alexandria. The irony is that our greatest achievement might also be our greatest vulnerability. We've learned to store vast amounts of information, but we've stored it in formats that require complex technology to access. If that technology disappeared, most of our accumulated knowledge would become unreadable within a single generation. Future archaeologists digging through our ruins might find hard drives and optical discs, but without the machines to read them, they'd be nothing more than curious artifacts. The information would be there, but it would be as inaccessible as hieroglyphs before the Rosetta Stone was discovered. This is probably what happened to previous cycles. They developed their own methods of storing information, but when their civilizations collapsed, the knowledge became inaccessible to the survivors. Over time, even the memory of what had been lost would fade, leaving only fragments preserved in oral traditions that gradually transformed into myths and legends. The stories we dismiss as primitive superstition might actually be our ancestors' attempts to preserve crucial information in the only format that could survive the collapse of complex civilizations. Oral traditions that encode scientific knowledge, historical events, and practical techniques in symbolic language designed to be memorable and transmittable across generations. When you start reading ancient myths with this perspective, they take on entirely different meanings. The flood stories aren't just moral tales about divine punishment. They're historical accounts of rising sea levels that destroyed coastal civilizations. The fire from heaven myths aren't supernatural events. They're descriptions of asteroid impacts or volcanic eruptions that reshaped the world. Even creation stories start making sense as compressed histories of how civilizations rebuilt after catastrophic resets. The gods, creating order from chaos, might be symbolic descriptions of how survivors organized themselves and began the long process of redevelopment. The gift of fire to humanity might commemorate the rediscovery of advanced technologies that had been lost in previous cycles. These interpretations aren't just speculation. We're starting to find evidence that supports them. Geological layers that show sudden climate changes matching the timelines described in various cultural traditions. Impact craters and volcanic deposits that correspond to periods when multiple civilizations seem to have collapsed simultaneously. The Younger Dryas event is probably the clearest example. Around 12,800 years ago, the world was warming up from the last ice age. Then suddenly, temperatures plunged back into freezing conditions for over 1,000 years. The cause is still debated, but many researchers believe it was triggered by a comet impact that set off massive wildfires and threw debris into the atmosphere. This event matches flood and fire myths from cultures around the world. The timing is right, the geographical distribution fits, and the severity would have been sufficient to collapse any advanced civilizations that existed at the time. If our ancestors had been developing agriculture and permanent settlements during the gradual warming period, the sudden return to Ice Age conditions would have been catastrophic. Their carefully built communities would have been abandoned. Their agricultural systems would have failed completely. Their populations would have been scattered or eliminated entirely. The survivors would have been forced to revert to nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles, carrying only fragments of memory about what their world had been like before the catastrophe. Over the following millennia, as conditions gradually improved and populations recovered, those fragments would have been woven into creation stories and flood myths. The accounts would have been reshaped by each generation of storytellers, but the core memory of a world-changing catastrophe would have survived. This is how reset evidence actually presents itself to us. Not as obvious ruins or clear artifacts, but as patterns in mythology that correspond to patterns in geology. Stories that seem symbolic but which encode real information about catastrophic events that reshaped human civilization. The challenge is learning to read these stories as historical documents rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. Because if we can decode them properly, they might contain crucial information about how previous civilizations dealt with reset events. What strategies worked for ensuring knowledge survival? What technologies were most likely to be preserved? What social structures helped communities rebuild most effectively after catastrophic disruption? These aren't just academic questions anymore. If the reset cycle is real, if our civilization is part of a pattern that's been repeating for hundreds of thousands of years, then understanding how previous iterations handled these challenges could be crucial for our own survival. Because the next reset is coming. Maybe not in our lifetimes, maybe not for thousands of years, but eventually. The geological record makes that clear. And when it arrives, all of our technological sophistication, all of our accumulated knowledge, all of our global infrastructure will be put to the ultimate test. The question isn't whether we can prevent it. The forces involved are too vast for any civilization to control. The question is whether we can survive it and what we can do to ensure that the most important parts of human knowledge and culture make it through to the next cycle. Previous civilizations probably faced the same challenge. They probably looked at their achievements and wondered how to preserve them for future generations. Some of them might have succeeded better than others. Some might have found ways to encode crucial information in formats that could survive the collapse of complex societies. If we're smart, if we're humble enough to learn from their experiences, we might be able to do better than they did. We might be able to break the cycle, or at least modify it so that each reset preserves more knowledge than the last one. But first, we have to accept that the cycle exists. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as the first and only advanced civilization Earth has produced, and start seeing ourselves as the latest iteration in a much older process. We have to understand that our time at the top is temporary, and that our greatest responsibility might not be reaching for the stars, but ensuring that something meaningful survives when our reach inevitably falls short. The evidence is all around us, scattered across the archaeological record like pieces of a puzzle we're finally starting to understand. Ancient knowledge that appears too advanced for its time. Structures that required capabilities we don't associate with their supposed builders. Myths that encode real information about catastrophic events. Geological layers that show sudden, dramatic changes in Earth's climate and environment. Each piece on its own can be explained away, But together, they paint a picture of a world far more complex and cyclical than the linear progression we've been taught to believe in. They suggest that Earth has been reset thousands of times, and that we're just the latest chapter in a story that's far from over. The question now is what we do with that knowledge. Do we use it to prepare for the inevitability of our own reset? Do we try to break the cycle somehow? Or do we simply accept our place in it and focus on making our contribution as meaningful as possible? Because one thing is certain, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we prepare for it or not, the cycle continues. Earth keeps turning, the geological forces keep building, and eventually, something will come along that's powerful enough to reset our world just as it has reset countless others before us. The only choice we have is how we respond to that reality. And time, as always, is running out. But what if the most disturbing truth about these resets isn't what they destroy, but what they reveal about the nature of time itself? We think of history as a straight line, moving from past to future in an orderly progression. But what if that's completely wrong? What if time on a planetary scale works more like a spiral, where similar events repeat at regular intervals, each cycle building on fragments left behind by the last? The geological evidence for this spiral pattern is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show regular cycles of warming and cooling that repeat every few thousand years with clockwork precision. Ocean sediment cores reveal patterns of volcanic activity, asteroid impacts, and mass extinctions that follow predictable rhythms stretching back millions of years. These aren't random disasters striking at arbitrary moments. They're part of a larger system, a planetary heartbeat that pulses through cycles of destruction and renewal. And if these cycles affect all life on Earth, why would human civilization be exempt? Consider what we know about solar activity. Our sun goes through regular cycles of increased and decreased energy output that last roughly 11 years. But there are longer cycles too, massive fluctuations that can last for centuries. During the Maunder Minimum, from 1645 to 1715, solar output dropped so dramatically that it triggered what historians call the Little Ice Age. Crop failures, famines, and social upheaval followed across Europe and Asia. That was just a minor solar fluctuation. Astronomical records show that our sun occasionally produces much more dramatic changes, coronal mass ejections powerful enough to strip away planetary atmospheres, gamma-ray bursts that could sterilize entire continents. These events happen on timescales measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years, but when they occur, they reset everything. The Carrington event of 1859 gives us a glimpse of what a major solar storm can do. Telegraph systems across the world failed catastrophically. Some operators received electric shocks, telegraph paper caught fire, and the aurora was visible as far south as the Caribbean. If a similar event happened today, it would destroy most of our electronic infrastructure. Satellites would fail, power grids would collapse, and our digital civilization would be crippled within hours. Now imagine something 10 times more powerful, or 100 times. The kind of solar event that happens every 50,000 years or so, according to ice core records. It would be like getting hit by an electromagnetic pulse that covers the entire planet. Every piece of electronic equipment would be fried instantly. Every data storage device would be wiped clean. Every communication system would go dark. Within weeks, our technological civilization would collapse completely. Not because of physical destruction, but because the invisible networks that hold everything together would simply stop working. Supply chains would break down, transportation systems would fail, and most people would find themselves completely unable to access the knowledge they depend on for survival. But here's what makes this particularly terrifying. We've become so dependent on electronic systems that most of our accumulated knowledge exists only in digital formats. Books are increasingly rare, replaced by e-readers and online databases. Technical manuals are stored on servers rather than printed on paper. Even basic skills like navigation and mathematics are handled by devices rather than human memory. If all of that disappeared overnight, we'd be left with whatever knowledge people could remember and whatever information happened to be preserved in physical formats. Most of our scientific achievements, our historical records, our artistic creations would become inaccessible within a single generation. The survivors would be forced to rebuild from whatever fragments they could piece together, exactly like the pattern we see throughout history. Advanced knowledge appearing in bursts, then disappearing for long periods, then being rediscovered in slightly different forms. Not because it was invented multiple times, but because it was being recovered from the ruins of previous cycles. This explains why certain innovations seem to appear independently in different cultures around the same time. The wheel, writing systems, agricultural techniques, astronomical observations. These weren't separate inventions happening by coincidence. They were rediscoveries of knowledge that had existed before, preserved in fragments and recovered when conditions allowed. The Maya calendar system is a perfect example. They calculated the length of the solar year to 365.2420 days, compared to our modern measurement of 365.2422 days. That's accurate to within minutes over the course of a year. But here's the thing. Achieving that level of precision requires observations spanning multiple centuries. You can't just look at the sky for a few years and figure out the exact length of the solar year. So either the Maya made astronomical observations for hundreds of years before they started recording their calendar, or they inherited measurements that had been made by someone else. Someone who had the time, the knowledge, and the institutional stability to carry out multi-generational observations of celestial mechanics. The same pattern appears in Egyptian astronomy, Chinese mathematics, and Babylonian engineering. Knowledge that seems far too advanced for the supposed level of development these cultures had reached when it first appears in their records. Not gradual development from simple concepts, but sophisticated understanding, appearing almost fully formed. Traditional archaeology explains this as rapid innovation driven by particularly brilliant individuals or favorable cultural conditions. But there's another possibility that fits the evidence better. These civilizations weren't inventing new knowledge. They were recovering old knowledge, piecing together fragments that had survived from previous cycles. The Great Pyramid of Giza demonstrates this perfectly. The precision of its construction is so exact that modern engineers struggle to explain how it was achieved. The blocks are cut and fitted with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The entire structure is aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3/60ths of a degree. The mathematical relationships encoded in its proportions include pi and the golden ratio. These aren't the achievements of a civilization that was just figuring out basic engineering. These are the accomplishments of people who already understood advanced mathematics, precision manufacturing, and astronomical alignment. The pyramid wasn't built by trial and error. It was built by people who knew exactly what they were doing because they were working from knowledge that already existed. But where did that knowledge come from? The conventional answer is that Egyptian civilization developed these capabilities gradually over centuries of practice. But the archaeological record doesn't support that interpretation. The earliest pyramids are among the most sophisticated. Later ones show declining quality and precision, not improvement. That's backwards from how technological development is supposed to work. You start with crude prototypes and gradually refine your techniques until you achieve mastery. You don't begin with perfection and then get worse at it over time. Unless the builders of the Great Pyramid weren't developing their techniques from scratch. Unless they were working from instructions, measurements, and methods that had been preserved from an earlier cycle of civilization. Knowledge that was complete when they inherited it, but which gradually degraded as the chain of transmission was broken by time and political upheaval. This would explain why so many ancient achievements seem impossibly advanced for their time, then disappear from the historical record for centuries or millennia. The knowledge existed, was applied briefly when conditions allowed, then was lost again when the civilizations that preserved it collapsed. The Library of Alexandria wasn't unique in this regard. It was just the most famous example of knowledge being concentrated, preserved, and then lost. But similar institutions existed throughout the ancient world. Centers of learning where scholars collected and maintained information from across the known world. When these institutions failed, either through war, natural disaster, or simple neglect, entire fields of knowledge vanished with them. Not because the information had never existed, but because the social structures that preserved it couldn't survive changing conditions. Now multiply this pattern by thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, each cycle reaching certain levels of achievement, preserving fragments of knowledge from previous cycles, adding their own discoveries, then losing most of it when their society collapsed. Each reset wiping away the accumulated progress of millennia, leaving only scattered survivors to rebuild from whatever pieces they could remember or recover. The cumulative effect would be exactly what we see in the archaeological record. Bursts of sophisticated achievement, separated by long periods of apparent regression. Not because human intelligence fluctuates, but because the social structures needed to preserve and transmit knowledge are fragile and temporary. This fragility isn't a bug in human civilization, it's a fundamental feature of how complex systems work. They require enormous amounts of energy and coordination to maintain, and they're vulnerable to disruption at multiple points. When key components fail, the entire system can collapse rapidly, even if most of the individual parts remain intact. We're seeing this vulnerability in our own civilization right now. Our global economy depends on just-in-time supply chains that have no redundancy built in. A disruption at any critical choke point can cascade through the entire system within days. The 2008 financial crisis showed how quickly confidence can evaporate and bring down institutions that seem too big to fail. A pandemic, a major cyber attack, a solar storm, or even a large volcanic eruption could trigger similar cascading failures across multiple systems simultaneously. Our interconnectedness, which we see as a strength, also makes us incredibly vulnerable to systemic collapse. Previous civilizations probably faced similar vulnerabilities. They built complex systems that worked well under normal conditions, but couldn't adapt quickly enough when conditions changed dramatically. When the reset events came, whether from climate change, natural disasters, or social upheaval, their specialized societies couldn't survive the transition back to subsistence living. The knowledge they had accumulated was preserved in formats that required the same complex systems to access. When those systems failed, the information became as inaccessible as data on a hard drive without electricity. The knowledge was still there, but it might as well have been destroyed. This is why oral traditions became so important for preserving crucial information across resets. Stories, songs, and rituals could be transmitted without requiring complex infrastructure. They could be modified and adapted as they passed from generation to generation, but the core information could survive even when everything else was lost. The flood myths, the fire from heaven stories, the tales of previous ages of humanity, these weren't just entertainment or moral instruction. They were survival manuals, encoding practical information about catastrophic events in formats designed to be memorable and transmittable across centuries of cultural disruption. When you start reading these stories as compressed historical accounts rather than symbolic myths, they become far more interesting. The details about which direction the floodwaters came from, how long the disasters lasted, what signs preceded them, these weren't random narrative elements. They were crucial information about how resets actually unfold. The Hindu concept of yugas, vast cycles of time where each age is longer and more peaceful than the one that follows, might be describing the actual rhythm of civilizational cycles. The idea that we're currently living in the Kali Yuga, the shortest and most chaotic of the ages, could be an accurate assessment of where we stand in the current cycle. Norse mythology describes Ragnarok as a series of catastrophic events that destroy the current world, but allow a new one to emerge from the ashes. The specific details, the wolves swallowing the sun and moon, the serpent stirring up the seas, the final battle between gods and monsters, these might be symbolic descriptions of actual astronomical and geological events that trigger resets. Even the biblical account of Noah's flood includes surprisingly specific details about the duration of the catastrophe, the geographical extent of the flooding, and the techniques used to survive it. These weren't arbitrary story elements chosen for dramatic effect. They were practical information preserved in narrative form. The same pattern appears in indigenous traditions around the world. Stories that describe previous worlds being destroyed by ice, fire, flood, or earthquake, followed by instructions for how the survivors rebuilt their societies. These accounts often include detailed knowledge about astronomy, agriculture, and social organization that seems far beyond what hunter-gatherer cultures should have possessed. But what if these weren't hunter-gatherer cultures at all? What if they were the remnants of much more advanced societies, preserving fragments of sophisticated knowledge in the only formats that could survive the collapse of complex civilization? This interpretation explains why so many indigenous cultures possess astronomical knowledge that requires centuries of careful observation to develop. They weren't developing this knowledge from scratch. They were maintaining traditions that had been passed down from civilizations that had already done the necessary observations. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of Australia include remarkably accurate descriptions of geological events that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Rising sea levels, volcanic eruptions, the formation of specific landscape features. These accounts match what geological evidence tells us about Australia's ancient history, but they describe events that occurred long before written records existed. How do oral traditions preserve accurate information about events that happened 40,000 years ago? The conventional explanation is that these are compressed cultural memories, simplified and mythologized versions of real events passed down through hundreds of generations. But that explanation assumes the cultures that preserved these stories remained at the same level of development throughout that entire period. What if that's wrong? What if some of these traditions originated with civilizations that had writing, permanent settlements, and sophisticated understanding of their environment, but were forced to abandon these technologies when reset events made them unsustainable? The survivors would have maintained whatever knowledge they could in oral form, passing it down through generations of descendants who lived simpler lifestyles, but preserved the memory of what their ancestors had known. Over time, the specific details would be forgotten, but the core information would survive embedded in stories that seemed mythical to later cultures. This process explains why mythological accounts often contain surprisingly accurate information about ancient events, but present it in symbolic rather than literal language. The stories weren't created as historical documents. They were created as memory devices, designed to preserve crucial information in formats that could survive the loss of written language and complex social institutions. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes detailed descriptions of a great flood that matches geological evidence for catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around the end of the last ice age. But it presents this information as a story about gods and heroes rather than as a straightforward historical account. The Popol Vuh of the Maya describes previous creations of the world being destroyed by various catastrophes, with each failed attempt leading to a new and improved version of humanity. This could be symbolic theology, but it could also be a compressed account of multiple reset events, each one leaving survivors who eventually rebuilt their civilization. The key insight is that these stories weren't created by primitive peoples trying to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. They were created by the survivors of sophisticated civilizations, people who understood exactly what had happened to their world and wanted to preserve that knowledge for future generations. The symbolic language wasn't chosen. because the storytellers couldn't think in literal terms. It was chosen because symbolic stories are more memorable, more transmittable, and more likely to survive cultural disruptions than dry factual accounts. This is probably why reset evidence appears in such fragmentary and puzzling forms. The people who lived through these events understood their significance perfectly, but they encoded their knowledge in formats designed for long-term preservation rather than immediate comprehension. They were thinking about what would survive centuries of cultural disruption, not what would be easiest for archaeologists to interpret. From their perspective, the priority wasn't proving to future scholars that their civilization had existed. The priority was ensuring that crucial survival information would be available when the next cycle needed to rebuild. They were less concerned with preserving their achievements than with preserving the knowledge necessary to achieve similar things again. This shift in perspective changes how we should be thinking about our own situation. Instead of trying to build monuments that will last forever, maybe we should be focusing on creating information storage systems that can survive the collapse of complex technological infrastructure. Instead of assuming our civilization will continue indefinitely, maybe we should be preparing for the possibility that it won't, and thinking about what knowledge would be most crucial for helping survivors rebuild after the next reset. Because if the pattern holds, if Earth really does operate on cycles of destruction and renewal, then our current technological civilization is just another iteration in a much longer process. We're not the culmination of history. We're just the latest attempt. And like all the attempts that came before us, our time is limited. The question isn't whether the next reset will come. The geological record makes it clear that such events are inevitable. The question is what we can do to ensure that the most important parts of human knowledge and culture survive the transition and help the next cycle rebuild more effectively than we did. Previous civilizations probably faced the same challenge. They probably looked at their achievements and wondered how to preserve them for future generations. Some of them might have succeeded better than others. Some might have found ways to encode crucial information in formats that could survive the collapse of their societies. If we're smart, if we're humble enough to learn from patterns that have been repeating for hundreds of thousands of years, we might be able to do better than they did. We might be able to break the cycle, or at least modify it, so that each reset preserves more knowledge than the last one. But first, we have to acknowledge that we're part of the cycle. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as the first and only advanced civilization Earth has produced, and start seeing ourselves as the latest iteration in a much older process. We have to understand that our achievements, no matter how impressive they seem to us, are temporary expressions of patterns that have been playing out far longer than recorded history. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. In the geological layers that show regular cycles of catastrophic change, in the archaeological anomalies that don't fit our linear timeline, in the myths and legends that encode real information about ancient events, in the sudden appearances of advanced knowledge followed by long periods of apparent regression. Each piece of evidence on its own might be explained away, but together they paint a picture of a world caught in cycles of rise and fall that dwarf anything we've experienced in recorded history. They suggest that Earth has been reset thousands of times, and that we're standing on the accumulated debris of countless previous attempts at civilization. The silence of deep time isn't empty. It's full of stories we haven't learned to read yet, achievements we can't recognize as artificial, knowledge preserved in formats we don't understand how to decode. Beneath our feet, scattered across ocean floors, buried under miles of sediment, there could be technologies that would revolutionize our understanding of what's possible. But finding them requires changing how we think about time, about progress, and about our place in the larger story of this planet. It requires accepting that we're not outside the natural cycles that affect everything else on Earth. We're part of them, subject to the same forces of destruction and renewal that have shaped every other form of life that has ever existed here. And that's actually the most hopeful part of this entire perspective. Because if resets are natural, if they're part of how Earth maintains its long-term habitability, then they're not endings, they're new beginnings. Each cycle builds on what came before, even if the connection isn't obvious to those living through it. We're not facing the end of the world. We're facing the end of our world, and the beginning of whatever comes next. The question is, what role we'll play in that transition, and what we can contribute to the cycle that will outlast us. Because the cycle will continue, with or without us. Earth will keep turning, life will keep adapting, and eventually, something will emerge that looks back at our ruins the way we look back at the mysterious achievements of our ancestors. They'll wonder who we were, what we knew, and why we disappeared. The answer they find will depend on what we choose to preserve and how we choose to preserve it. The reset is coming. The only question is what survives to help write the next chapter of the story. The most chilling realization about our place in this cosmic cycle isn't what we might lose in the next reset, but what we've already lost without even knowing it. Right now, as you're sitting there watching this, there could be solutions to humanity's greatest challenges buried beneath our feet. Technologies that took previous civilizations millennia to develop, sitting in ruins we haven't found or encoded in symbols we can't read. Think about that for a moment. We're pouring trillions of dollars into solving energy crises, climate change, space exploration, diseases that kill millions every year. What if the answers are already out there, locked away in underwater cities, or carved into stones we've dismissed as natural formations? This isn't wild speculation anymore. We keep finding evidence that our ancestors possess knowledge they shouldn't have had. The precision of the Great Pyramid's construction baffles modern engineers. Ancient maps show coastlines that were supposedly unknown for thousands of years. Cultures separated by oceans tell identical stories about catastrophic floods and previous ages of humanity. Each discovery forces us to push back the timeline of human achievement. Each artifact makes the gaps in our understanding more obvious. And the pattern that emerges is deeply unsettling, because it suggests we're not climbing towards some unprecedented peak of civilization. We're just the latest group to think we've figured it all out. Consider the Younger Dryas period, 12,800 years ago. The world had been warming steadily as the Ice Age ended. Agricultural communities were developing. Complex societies were forming along fertile river valleys and coastlines. Then something catastrophic happened that plunged temperatures back into freezing conditions for over 1,000 years. Geological evidence points to a comet impact that triggered massive wildfires across North America. The debris thrown into the atmosphere blocked sunlight and caused rapid global cooling. Any civilization that had been developing during the gradual warming would have faced immediate collapse. Their crops would have failed, their settlements would have been abandoned, their populations scattered to the winds. The survivors would have reverted to nomadic lifestyles not by choice, but by necessity. Within a few generations, most knowledge of what their world had been like before the catastrophe would have been lost. Only fragments would survive, preserved in oral traditions that gradually transformed into myths about floods and fires from the sky. This pattern repeats throughout the geological record. Sudden climate shifts, massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, each one powerful enough to reset any complex civilization that might have existed when it occurred. And these aren't rare events on planetary timescales. They happen regularly, predictably, like a cosmic heartbeat that pulses through cycles of destruction and renewal. The Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago nearly drove humanity to extinction. Genetic studies suggest our entire species was reduced to perhaps just a few thousand survivors scattered across Africa. If advanced civilizations had existed before that event, they would have been wiped out so completely that we'd never know they had been there. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. We've become more vulnerable to these reset events, not less. Our global civilization depends on interconnected systems that have no redundancy built in. A major solar storm could knock out electrical grids worldwide. crippling the digital infrastructure our society depends on. A volcanic eruption on the scale of Toba could trigger crop failures that would lead to mass starvation within months. Previous civilizations might have been more resilient because they were more decentralized. When one region got hit by catastrophe, others could survive and eventually help rebuild. But we've created a single, integrated global system where disruption anywhere can cascade everywhere. Our interconnectedness, which we see as progress, might actually be making us more fragile than our ancestors were. The archaeological evidence for this fragility is everywhere once you know how to look for it. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE destroyed advanced civilizations across the Mediterranean. Writing systems disappeared, trade networks vanished, technologies were lost for centuries, and that happened during recorded history when we have documents describing what was lost. Imagine similar collapses occurring during prehistoric periods, when there were no written records to preserve the memory of what existed before. Entire cycles of civilization could rise and fall without leaving any obvious trace for future archaeologists to discover. This explains why human development seems to happen in sudden bursts rather than steady progression. The agricultural revolution around 10,000 years ago wasn't humanity's first discovery of farming. It was probably the rediscovery of techniques that had been lost during the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The rapid development of writing systems, mathematics, and astronomy in various cultures wasn't independent innovation. It was the recovery of knowledge that had existed before. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern measurements, but achieving that level of precision requires observations spanning multiple centuries. Either they made astronomical calculations for hundreds of years before they started recording their findings, or they inherited measurements from someone else. Someone who had already done the necessary work. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes over 25,000 years to complete. How do you observe something that spans dozens of human generations unless you're building on knowledge accumulated by previous civilizations? The same pattern appears worldwide. Sophisticated astronomical understanding appearing almost fully formed in cultures that supposedly had just figured out basic agriculture. Advanced mathematical concepts emerging without the gradual development you'd expect if they were being discovered for the first time. Traditional archaeology explains this as rapid innovation driven by exceptional individuals or favorable cultural conditions. But there's another interpretation that fits the evidence better. These civilizations weren't inventing new knowledge. They were reconstructing old knowledge, piecing together fragments that had survived from earlier cycles. The megalithic sites scattered across the globe support this interpretation. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built over 11,000 years ago with techniques that required organization and skills far beyond what hunter-gatherers were supposed to possess. The precision stone cutting at Puma Punku in Bolivia, achieved with tolerances tighter than modern machinery can replicate. The astronomical alignments at sites worldwide that demonstrate deep understanding of celestial mechanics. These weren't the achievements of primitive peoples getting lucky. They were the products of knowledge systems that already existed, being applied by cultures that had inherited fragments of understanding from previous cycles. But here's what's really unsettling about this pattern. If we're part of the same cycle, if our civilization is just the latest iteration in a process that's been repeating for hundreds of thousands of years, then we need to start thinking very seriously about what our contribution will be. What knowledge are we developing that might survive the next reset? What problems are we solving that future civilizations will need to rediscover? What are we building that could serve as foundations for whatever comes after us? Because the next reset is inevitable, not in our lifetimes necessarily, but eventually. The geological record makes that clear. Yellowstone is overdue for a supervolcanic eruption. The Cascadia subduction zone could generate a massive earthquake and tsunami. A solar storm could knock out electrical systems globally. An asteroid impact could trigger rapid climate change. Any of these events could serve as reset triggers, powerful enough to collapse our technological civilization and force survivors back to subsistence living. And unlike previous cycles, we've become so specialized that most people couldn't survive without the complex systems we depend on. How many people today know how to grow food without industrial agriculture? How many could make tools from raw materials? How many understand the basic principles behind the technologies they use daily? We've created incredible sophistication, but we've also created incredible vulnerability. Most of our knowledge exists in digital formats that require electricity and maintained infrastructure to access. If those systems failed, the information would become as inaccessible as data on a hard drive without power. This is probably what happened to previous cycles. They developed their own methods of information storage, but when their civilizations collapsed, the knowledge became unreachable. Over time, even the memory of what had been lost would fade, leaving only fragments preserved in stories that gradually became myths. The flood narratives found in virtually every culture aren't random coincidences. They're cultural memories of the catastrophic sea level rises that occurred when the last ice age ended. The fire from heaven stories aren't supernatural events. They're accounts of asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions that reshaped the world. These myths weren't created by primitive peoples trying to explain phenomena they didn't understand. They were created by survivors of sophisticated civilizations who wanted to preserve crucial information about catastrophic events in formats that could survive the collapse of complex societies. The symbolic language wasn't chosen because the storytellers couldn't think literally. It was chosen because symbolic stories are more memorable and more likely to be transmitted across generations than factual accounts. They were encoding survival manuals in narrative form. When you read ancient texts with this perspective, they take on entirely different meanings. The Hindu concept of cyclical time, with vast ages of creation and destruction. The Aztec belief that they were living in the fifth world after 4 previous creations had been destroyed. The Norse concept of Ragnarok, where the current world ends, but a new one emerges. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were descriptions of processes their ancestors had witnessed and remembered. Processes we're still part of, whether we recognize it or not. The most disturbing implication is that we might be approaching the end of our own cycle. Climate change is accelerating. Natural disasters are becoming more frequent and severe. Our global systems are showing signs of strain that could lead to cascading failures. Previous civilizations probably experienced similar warning signs before their worlds ended. They probably assumed their knowledge and achievements would last forever, right up until they didn't. But there's also a hopeful side to this perspective. If resets are natural parts of how Earth maintains its long-term habitability, then they're not really endings. They're transitions. Each cycle builds on what came before, even when the connections aren't obvious. The knowledge we develop, the problems we solve, the art we create, all of it becomes part of a larger pool of information that somehow survives even when individual civilizations don't. The wheel wasn't invented multiple times by different cultures. It was remembered. Writing systems weren't developed independently. They were reconstructed from fragments. Our achievements aren't isolated events. They're contributions to a story much larger than any single civilization can comprehend. The technologies we develop today might provide foundations for rebuilding after the next reset. The problems we solve might help future iterations avoid mistakes we've made. This changes how we should think about our responsibilities. Instead of assuming our civilization will continue indefinitely, maybe we should be preparing for the possibility that it won't. Instead of building monuments designed to last forever, maybe we should focus on creating knowledge preservation systems that can survive technological collapse. The geological layers beneath our feet contain the compressed history of countless previous attempts at complex life. Each layer represents a world that rose, flourished, and fell, making room for whatever came next. We're just the current layer being deposited. And eventually, we'll become part of the foundation for future attempts. The silence of deep time isn't empty. It's full of stories we haven't learned to read yet, achievements we can't recognize as artificial, knowledge preserved in formats we don't understand. Somewhere in that silence are the voices of civilizations that face the same challenges we're facing now. They looked up at the same stars we see. They wondered about their place in the cosmos. They built societies they hoped would last forever. And when the resets came, they did their best to preserve what mattered most for whoever would come after them. Now it's our turn. We're the latest chapter in Earth's ongoing experiment with intelligence and consciousness. We don't know how long our chapter will last, but we know it won't last forever. The question is, what legacy we'll leave for the next chapter to build upon? Because the story continues, with or without us. Earth keeps turning, life keeps adapting, and eventually, something new emerges from the ruins of what came before. The cycle of reset and renewal that's been running for billions of years will outlast our species, our planet, and probably our solar system. But for now, for this brief moment in cosmic time, we're the ones telling the story. We're the latest iteration of Earth's attempt to understand itself through conscious beings. And maybe, if we're very careful and very wise, we can make our contribution meaningful enough to echo through whatever cycles come next. The resets are coming. They always have been, and they always will be. But each time, something survives to carry the torch forward. Each time, the experiment begins again, building on fragments of what came before. We're not the end of the story. We're not even the beginning. We're somewhere in the middle of something so vast and ancient that we can barely glimpse its true scope. But we're here now, conscious and curious, trying to understand our place in the pattern. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being aware of the cycle, even briefly, is what intelligence is for. Maybe our job isn't to escape the pattern, but to participate in it consciously. To add our voice to the chorus of civilizations that have wondered about these same questions across millions of years. The Earth has been reset thousands of times. It will be reset thousands more. But each time the story gets a little richer, a little more complex, a little closer to whatever ultimate purpose drives this cosmic dance of destruction and creation. We're part of that dance now. We might as well make it count. But what if the most terrifying aspect of these resets isn't their inevitability, but the possibility that we're accelerating toward one right now? The signs are everywhere once you start paying attention. Our climate is shifting faster than any natural cycle should allow. Our technological systems are becoming so complex that even their creators don't fully understand how they work. Our global civilization has become a house of cards where the failure of any critical component could bring down the entire structure. Consider what happened during the 2008 financial crisis. Within days, institutions that had existed for over a century simply vanished. Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in the world, went from being a pillar of global finance to worthless paper in less than a week. The entire system nearly collapsed because of interconnections so complex that nobody fully understood the risks they had created. Now imagine something similar happening across multiple systems simultaneously. A major solar storm knocks out electrical grids, while a pandemic disrupts supply chains, and a financial crisis destroys confidence in global markets. Each problem on its own might be manageable, but together they could trigger cascading failures that overwhelm our ability to respond. This kind of systemic vulnerability is exactly what we see in the archaeological record before major civilizational collapses. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of a single catastrophic event. It collapsed because multiple stresses: climate change, economic instability, political upheaval, and external pressures combined to overwhelm a system that had become too rigid to adapt. The Maya civilization shows the same pattern. For centuries, They built increasingly complex cities and agricultural systems that worked perfectly under stable conditions. But when climate change brought extended droughts, their specialized society couldn't adjust quickly enough. Within decades, cities that had thrived for generations were abandoned to the jungle. These weren't primitive societies that failed because they lacked technology. They were sophisticated civilizations that failed because their technology had made them too dependent on conditions that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Sound familiar? We've created a global civilization that requires constant inputs of energy, resources, and coordination to function. Our cities depend on food grown thousands of miles away. Our technology relies on rare earth elements mined in politically unstable regions. Our financial systems depend on trust and confidence that could evaporate overnight. When you map out these dependencies, what emerges is a picture of incredible fragility disguised as strength. We've optimized for efficiency at the cost of resilience. We've created systems that work beautifully when everything goes according to plan, but which have no backup options when something goes wrong. The geological record suggests that this pattern has repeated many times throughout Earth's history. Civilizations reach a certain level of complexity and specialization, then become so dependent on maintaining specific conditions that they can't survive when those conditions change. The reset events don't destroy them directly. They create disruptions that expose how fragile the entire system had become. But here's where it gets really unsettling. The resets themselves might be getting more frequent, not because catastrophic events are happening more often, but because our civilizations are becoming vulnerable to smaller and smaller disruptions. A volcanic eruption that would have been survivable by a decentralized agricultural society could be civilization ending for a technological society dependent on global supply chains and electronic infrastructure. An asteroid impact that would have been a regional disaster in the past could trigger worldwide collapse through interconnected systems that have no redundancy built in. We've created a civilization that's incredibly powerful, but also incredibly brittle, like a Formula One race car that can achieve amazing speeds, but breaks down if you hit a small bump the wrong way. The evidence for this increasing brittleness is everywhere you look. A single cargo ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal disrupted global trade for weeks. A cyber attack on a single pipeline caused gasoline shortages across an entire region. A pandemic that would have been manageable with medieval technology nearly brought our advanced medical systems to their knees. Each of these events was relatively minor on a historical scale, but they reveal just how dependent we've become on systems that we don't fully control and can't easily replace. We've built a civilization of incredible sophistication on foundations that are far more fragile than we want to admit. And the really disturbing part is that we're aware of these vulnerabilities, but we keep making them worse instead of better. Every new technology we develop makes us more dependent on electronic systems that could be wiped out by a solar storm. Every supply chain optimization reduces our ability to survive disruptions. Every step toward greater efficiency takes us further away from the redundancy that would help us survive unexpected shocks. Previous civilizations probably went through similar processes. They developed technologies that seemed to make life easier and more secure, not realizing they were actually making themselves more vulnerable to systemic collapse. They optimized their societies for the conditions they knew, not for the disruptions they couldn't predict. The survivors of those collapses would have learned hard lessons about the dangers of over-specialization and excessive complexity. They would have understood that resilience is more important than efficiency, that distributed systems are more stable than centralized ones, that keeping some knowledge and skills at the local level is crucial for surviving global disruptions. But those lessons would have been lost when the survivors died, and their children grew up in a world where the old catastrophes seemed like ancient history. Each new generation would have rediscovered the benefits of complexity and specialization, gradually rebuilding the same vulnerabilities that had destroyed their ancestors. This is probably why the reset cycle keeps repeating. It's not that catastrophic events keep randomly destroying civilizations. It's that civilizations keep making the same mistakes, building the same fragilities, and becoming vulnerable to the same kinds of systemic collapse. We're following the exact same pattern right now. We're building systems of incredible complexity without understanding their failure modes. We're creating dependencies we can't control and eliminating redundancies we might desperately need. We're optimizing for short-term efficiency at the cost of long-term survival. The archaeological evidence for this pattern is scattered across the globe in the form of civilizations that seem to be at their peak right before they collapsed completely. The Indus Valley civilization shows no signs of gradual decline. One day they had thriving cities with sophisticated drainage systems and standardized weights and measures. The next day, archaeologically speaking, those cities were abandoned and the entire civilization had vanished. The same pattern appears in the archaeological record of the Maya, the Anasazi, the Rapa Nui civilization on Easter Island, and dozens of other societies that reached impressive levels of achievement before disappearing with shocking suddenness. In each case, the civilization had become so specialized and dependent on specific conditions that it couldn't adapt when those conditions changed. They had optimized themselves into evolutionary dead ends, creating systems that worked perfectly until they didn't work at all. We're doing exactly the same thing, but on a global scale that dwarfs anything previous civilizations attempted. We've created a single, integrated planetary civilization with no backup systems and no plan B. If our current approach fails, there's nowhere else to go and no alternative systems to fall back on. The reset events documented in the geological record suggest that Earth itself has mechanisms for dealing with civilizations that become too successful for their own good. Mass extinctions occur with regular frequency, clearing away dominant species that have become over-specialized and making room for new forms of life to evolve. The question isn't whether the next reset will come. The question is whether it's already beginning. The signs are certainly there if you know how to read them. Rapid climate change that's outpacing natural cycles. Technological systems becoming so complex that they're developing emergent behaviors their creators never intended. Global supply chains stretching to the breaking point while political systems struggle to coordinate responses to planetary scale challenges. Previous reset events have left clear signatures in the geological record. Sudden climate shifts, mass extinctions, chemical changes in the atmosphere and oceans that indicate massive disruptions to normal planetary processes. Future geologists studying our era will probably see similar signatures being deposited right now. The difference is that we're conscious of what's happening. We can see the patterns that previous civilizations missed. We have access to information about past resets that could help us avoid the same mistakes. The question is whether we're wise enough to use that information, or whether we're too committed to our current path to change course. The archaeological record suggests that most civilizations choose to double down on the strategies that brought them success, even when those strategies are clearly leading toward collapse. They invest more heavily in the technologies and social structures that made them powerful, not realizing that those same innovations are making them vulnerable to systemic failure. We seem to be following the same pattern. Instead of building more resilient systems, we're building more efficient ones. Instead of creating redundancy, we're eliminating it. Instead of distributing critical functions, we're concentrating them in fewer and fewer locations. Every major corporation talks about supply chain optimization, which usually means eliminating backup suppliers and reducing inventory to the absolute minimum. Every government talks about efficiency improvements, which usually means cutting redundant systems and consolidating functions. Every technology company talks about seamless integration, which usually means creating more single points of failure. These approaches work beautifully under normal conditions, but they create exactly the kind of fragility that makes civilizations vulnerable to reset events. When something goes wrong, there are no backup systems to take over, no alternative suppliers to fill gaps, no redundant pathways to maintain critical functions. The COVID-19 pandemic gave us a small taste of what happens when our optimized systems encounter unexpected disruptions. Supply chains that had worked flawlessly for decades suddenly couldn't deliver basic necessities. Healthcare systems that seemed adequate in normal times were overwhelmed within weeks. Political systems that appeared stable were stretched to the breaking point by the need to coordinate responses to a global crisis. And that was from a relatively minor disruption by historical standards. The 1918 flu pandemic was far more deadly. The Toba supervolcano eruption was orders of magnitude more disruptive. A major asteroid impact or solar storm would make COVID look like a minor inconvenience. Yet instead of learning from the pandemic experience and building more resilient systems, we're mostly trying to get back to the same optimized but fragile approaches that failed us in the first place. We're rebuilding the same vulnerabilities instead of addressing the underlying problems that made us vulnerable. This is exactly the pattern we see in the archaeological record. Civilizations that experienced partial collapses but managed to recover usually tried to rebuild the same systems that had failed them, rather than developing new approaches that might be more resilient. They were so invested in their existing technologies and social structures that they couldn't imagine alternatives. The result was that they became vulnerable to the same kinds of disruptions that had caused problems before, and when those disruptions occurred again, they were no better prepared than they had been the first time. Eventually, the accumulating stresses overwhelmed their ability to recover, and the civilization collapsed completely. We might be at exactly that point right now. The warning signs are everywhere, but we're so committed to our current approach that we can't see them clearly. We keep trying to solve new problems with old methods, not realizing that those methods are part of what's creating the problems. Climate change is accelerating because our economic systems are designed around continuous growth and resource consumption. Political instability is increasing because our governance systems weren't designed to handle planetary scale coordination. Technological risks are multiplying because we're developing capabilities faster than we can understand their implications. Each of these challenges requires fundamental changes to how we organize society, but we keep trying to address them with minor adjustments to existing systems. We're trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century institutions and 19th century economic theories. The archaeological record suggests that this approach never works. Civilizations that try to solve new challenges with old methods eventually encounter problems they can't address within their existing frameworks. When that happens, they either transform completely or they collapse. Transformation requires abandoning investments in existing systems and developing entirely new approaches. That's incredibly difficult for any civilization to do voluntarily, especially when the existing systems are still providing benefits to the people who control them. Collapse happens when the problems overwhelm the civilization's ability to respond, forcing transformation whether they want it or not. But post-collapse transformation usually happens at a much lower level of complexity, with much of the accumulated knowledge and capability being lost in the transition. The choice we face is whether to transform voluntarily while we still have the resources and knowledge to do it effectively, or to wait until circumstances force transformation upon us. The geological record suggests that most civilizations choose to wait, and that choice usually doesn't end well. But occasionally, just occasionally, you find evidence of civilizations that manage to navigate major transitions successfully. They're rare in the archaeological record, probably because successful transitions don't leave the same kind of dramatic ruins that sudden collapses do. These successful transitions seem to involve developing more distributed, resilient systems before the old centralized systems failed completely. Instead of trying to maintain existing approaches indefinitely, they gradually shifted toward new methods that were better adapted to changing conditions. The key insight is that transformation has to happen before collapse, not after. Once a civilization has lost its accumulated knowledge and organizational capacity, rebuilding becomes much more difficult. The survivors are forced to start over from basics, and it can take thousands of years to recover capabilities that were lost in just a few decades. This is why the next few decades are so crucial for our own civilization. We still have the resources and knowledge needed to develop more resilient systems, but that window won't stay open indefinitely. Climate change is accelerating, technological risks are multiplying, and social tensions are increasing. If we wait too long to address these challenges, we might find ourselves dealing with them from a much weaker position. The archaeological evidence suggests that we're not the first civilization to face this kind of choice. Previous societies have stood at similar crossroads with the knowledge and capability needed to transform their systems, but also with strong incentives to maintain existing approaches. Most of them chose to maintain the status quo until circumstances made that choice impossible. The ones that survived long-term were the ones that found ways to change course before they were forced to. The question is whether we're smart enough to learn from their experiences, or whether we're doomed to repeat the same patterns that have led to reset after reset throughout Earth's history. The evidence is scattered across our world like pieces of a puzzle we're only beginning to understand, ancient knowledge appearing too early in our timeline. Structures requiring capabilities we don't associate with their supposed builders, myths encoding real information about catastrophic events, geological layers showing sudden dramatic changes in Earth's climate and environment. Each piece might be explained away individually, but together they paint a picture of a planet caught in cycles of rise and fall that dwarf anything we've experienced in recorded history. They suggest that Earth has been reset thousands of times, and that we're just the latest chapter in a story that's far from over. The silence of deep time isn't empty. It's full of voices trying to warn us about patterns we haven't learned to recognize yet. Civilizations that face the same challenges we're facing now. People who looked up at the same stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos. Just like we do. They built societies they hoped would last forever. They developed technologies they thought would solve all their problems. They created systems of incredible complexity and sophistication. And when the resets came, they did their best to preserve what mattered most for whoever would come after them. Now it's our turn to decide what we'll preserve and how we'll preserve it. Because the next reset is coming, whether we're ready or not. The only question is what will survive to help the next iteration of civilization rebuild from our ruins. The cycle continues, with or without us. Earth keeps turning. Life keeps adapting. And eventually, something new emerges from the ashes of what came before. We're part of that cycle now, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question isn't whether we can escape the pattern. The question is whether we can participate in it consciously, contributing something meaningful to the ongoing experiment with intelligence and consciousness that's been running on this planet for millions of years. Every civilization thinks it's special. Every generation believes it's the one that will finally break free from the cycles that trapped their predecessors. Most of them are wrong, but occasionally, just occasionally, someone figures out how to work with the pattern instead of against it. Someone learns to build systems that can survive resets instead of systems that make resets inevitable. Maybe that's what intelligence is really for. Not to escape the natural cycles that govern everything else, but to participate in them more consciously. To add our voice to the chorus of civilizations that have wondered about these same questions across deep time. We're not the end of the story. We're not even close to the beginning. We're somewhere in the middle of something so vast and ancient that we can barely glimpse its true scope. But we're here now, conscious and curious, trying to understand our place in the pattern. And maybe, if we're very careful and very wise, we can make our brief moment count for something larger than ourselves. The resets are coming. They always have been, and they always will be. But each time, something survives to carry the experiment forward. Each time, the pattern gets a little richer, a little more complex, a little closer to whatever ultimate purpose drives this cosmic dance of destruction and creation. We're part of that dance now. The music is playing, the stage is set, and our performance has already begun. The only question is whether we'll dance gracefully or stumble through our steps, whether we'll add something beautiful to the performance or just make noise until our time runs out. The choice is ours. But the dance itself will continue long after we're gone, waiting for the next performers to take the stage and try their hand at the eternal choreography of rise and fall, death and rebirth that has been playing out on this small blue planet for longer than we can imagine. The Earth has been reset thousands of times. It will be reset thousands more, and each time the story continues, richer and stranger than before. We stand at a crossroads that every civilization before us has faced, though none of them knew it at the time. The decision isn't whether to believe in resets or dismiss them as fantasy. The decision is what we do with the growing mountain of evidence that suggests our entire understanding of time, progress, and human achievement might be fundamentally wrong. Because here's what we know for certain now. The geological record shows regular cycles of catastrophic change stretching back billions of years. The archaeological record shows sudden appearances of advanced knowledge followed by mysterious disappearances. The mythological record shows identical stories of destruction and rebirth appearing in cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. And our own civilization shows every sign of following the exact same pattern that led previous societies to collapse. The question isn't whether Earth operates on cycles of reset and renewal. The evidence for that is overwhelming once you know where to look. The question is whether we're smart enough to recognize what's happening and wise enough to do something about it before it's too late. Consider what we've learned just in the past few decades. Every year brings new archaeological discoveries that push back the timeline of human achievement. Göbekli Tepe forces us to admit that complex societies existed thousands of years before we thought possible. Underwater ruins around the world prove that advanced civilizations were building along coastlines that are now hundreds of feet below sea level. Ancient maps show geographical knowledge that shouldn't have existed until modern times. Megalithic structures display engineering capabilities that we struggle to replicate today. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge appears in cultures that were supposedly just figuring out basic agriculture. Each discovery on its own might be an anomaly. But when you step back and look at the pattern, when you see how these anomalies cluster around certain time periods and align with geological evidence of catastrophic events, the picture becomes clear. We're not the first advanced civilization this planet has produced. We're just the latest in a long series of attempts, each one building on fragments inherited from the cycles that came before. This isn't speculation anymore, it's pattern recognition. And the pattern shows that civilizations rise, reach impressive heights, then get knocked back to basics by forces beyond their control. The survivors rebuild from whatever fragments they can preserve, gradually rediscovering capabilities their ancestors possessed, adding their own innovations, then eventually facing their own reset event. The cycle repeats with clockwork regularity, driven by astronomical forces, geological processes, and the inherent instability of complex systems that become too specialized for their own good. But here's what makes our situation unique. We're the first civilization in this cycle to have developed the scientific tools necessary to recognize the pattern. Previous societies might have sensed they were part of something larger, encoding warnings and instructions in myths and monuments, but they couldn't see the full scope of what was happening. We can. We have ice core data going back hundreds of thousands of years. We have geological evidence of impact events and volcanic eruptions. We have genetic studies showing population bottlenecks that match the timing of catastrophic climate changes. We have archaeological anomalies that make sense only if advanced knowledge was being preserved and rediscovered across multiple cycles. For the first time in Earth's history, a civilization understands that it's part of a repeating pattern. We know the resets are coming because we can see their signatures written in rock and ice and bone. We know previous civilizations existed because we keep finding their scattered remains. We know knowledge gets lost and rediscovered because we can trace the same innovations appearing independently in cultures separated by thousands of years. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Most civilizations that reach this level of understanding probably assumed they could use their knowledge to break free from the cycle. They probably believed their technology would protect them from the natural forces that had destroyed their predecessors. They probably thought they were different, special, immune to the patterns that had governed everyone else. They were wrong. The geological record shows that resets continued happening right up through periods when advanced civilizations definitely existed. Knowledge of the pattern doesn't automatically provide immunity from it, but it might provide something almost as valuable: the opportunity to participate consciously instead of blindly, to make choices about what to preserve and how to preserve it, to influence what the next cycle inherits from ours, because the cycle will continue whether we want it to or not. Earth's astronomical position changes on predictable schedules. Solar output fluctuates in regular patterns. Tectonic forces build up stress that gets released in massive earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Asteroid impacts occur with statistical inevitability over long enough time periods. These aren't random disasters striking at arbitrary moments. They're part of planetary systems that operate on scales much larger than human civilizations. We can predict them, prepare for them, and potentially mitigate some of their effects. But we can't prevent them entirely. What remains is the most profound realization of all. We're not witnesses to history. We're participants in a story so vast that most of it unfolds in the spaces between our heartbeats. Every breath you take happens against the backdrop of cycles that have been turning since before our species existed and will continue turning long after we're gone. The evidence surrounds us like whispers in an ancient language we're only beginning to translate, in the precision of megalithic structures that shouldn't exist, in the astronomical knowledge preserved by cultures that supposedly lived in darkness, in the flood stories that echo across every continent, in the geological layers that record sudden catastrophes with clockwork regularity. Each fragment tells the same story. Earth doesn't just host civilization. It creates it, nurtures it, tests it, and when the time comes, wipes it clean to begin again. We're not the culmination of this process. We're not even close to the beginning. We're somewhere in the middle of an experiment that's been running for millions of years, and our chapter is almost certainly not the last. But maybe that's not terrifying. Maybe it's liberating. Because if we're part of a pattern larger than ourselves, then our achievements aren't isolated accidents. They're contributions to something that transcends any individual civilization. The knowledge we develop, the problems we solve, the beauty we create, all of it becomes part of a vast library that somehow survives even when the buildings that housed it crumble to dust. The wheel keeps getting reinvented because the wheel was never really lost. Writing keeps being rediscovered because the need to record and remember is encoded in the very structure of consciousness itself. Mathematics keeps emerging because the relationships it describes are fundamental to how reality operates. We're not starting from zero. We're picking up threads that have been woven and rewoven countless times before. And when our time ends, as it inevitably will, those threads will be picked up again by whatever comes next. The resets will continue. The cycle will turn. And somewhere in that turning, in the space between one world's ending and another's beginning, the experiment continues. Earth keeps exploring what's possible when matter becomes conscious of itself, when the universe develops the ability to look back at its own history and wonder what it all means. That's what we are. That's what we've always been. Not the first to ask these questions, and certainly not the last. Just the latest voice in a conversation that's been going on for longer than we can imagine, and will continue long after our voice fades to silence. The Earth has been reset thousands of times, and each time it gets a little closer to whatever answer it's searching for.